Game Time with Boomer Esiason. This week's guest is Joe Namath. Brought to you by GoDaddy and Geico.
All right, today's guest was an All-American quarterback at the University of Alabama who went on to change football forever by leading the New York Jets to a historic victory in Super Bowl III. Now, he details that monumental upset along with the rest of his remarkable career in his candid new autobiography, All the Way, My Life in Four Quarters. It's certainly my pleasure to welcome Broadway Joe Namath. Joe, great to see you, man. It's so great to have you here. And I have to tell you, as a quarterback from my generation, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for everything that you did, paving the way for us, because you know what? You set the tone for all of us. You had a brand. You were Broadway Joe Namath.
Well, Boomer, thank you for saying that, but the fact of the matter is, with me, the way I look at it, I was lucky.
All the Way, My Life in Four Quarters, a book that basically you bare your soul. What was the inspiration for writing this book?
It was the 50th anniversary of our championship game win.
Could you have ever realized that the NFL would have turned into what it is, due in large part to that victory that you had in Super Bowl III?
I didn't look that far ahead. I was lucky. I was happy to have a job to play football and wanted to win a championship.
The amazing thing is that you took pro football by storm, but before that you were at the University of Alabama. But even before that, you wanted to go to where I went to school, the University of Maryland. Now, here's the thing that we have a number of things in common. I don't know if you know this. So you wanted to go to Maryland. I ended up at Maryland. Nobody else wanted me but Maryland. You ended up at Alabama because you couldn't get into Maryland because of your SAT scores. Is that right?
College board, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I am smarter than you then, right? Okay?
That's fine with me.
That's right. Well, so you wanted to go to Maryland. Why did you want to go there? And how did you end up at the University of Alabama?
I wanted to go to Maryland for a few reasons. Some guys from Western Pennsylvania were there as players already. The equipment manager I used to hang out with, he was helping recruit me for Tom Nugent, who was the coach at Maryland at the time. And Tom Nugent was the guy that started the I formation, and he loved to throw the ball, man. He convinced me that we were going to throw that ball a lot. So it was only 300 miles from the house in Western PA, and it was far enough away to get away,
right, yeah,
but close enough to come back.
I read a story. Now you got to tell me if this is true. Paul Bear Bryant used to stand on a scaffold watching practice. Is that right?
That's a fact. Yes.
He had never, ever allowed anybody up there, especially a player, with him when he was watching practice. Is that true?
I was told that.
Okay, I was told that too.
Yeah.
But for some reason, Joe Namath was allowed to go up there and watch practice with the great Paul Bear Bryant. What was it like climbing that scaffold to go watch that practice?
I really didn't know Coach Bryant. I didn't know his background, so I was okay. He wants to see me, so I'm climbing up there, and I got up, and he welcomed me, and I promise you, I couldn't understand what he was saying to me.
Really?
Finally, turned around, looked back at practice, and he said, "Oh, boy, understood." 2 minutes later, a minute later, he said, "Oh, he only stud." He kept saying it's the word stud, and I didn't know what it meant. And I really was confused, and I questioned whether I had come to the right place. But Howard Schnellenberger is the one that took me there.
Right.
After Coach Nugent and my college boards didn't measure up, Coach Nugent called Coach Bryant, and he had Howard fly up that day.
And your mom liked Howard Schnellenberger.
Yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely. He's a real gentleman, and I love him to this day, but he was a hard coach, man. He was hard.
Well, I'm sure he was hard, but, he did see something in you. He saw what I would call a stud. You are a stud, I think so. All right, we're just getting warmed up with Hall of Famer Joe Namath. Game Time will return right after this. Good job, man. Good start. Okay, we are ready to rock and roll.
You're watching Game Time with Boomer Esiason.
You know, Joe Namath grew up in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, an integrated community of North Pittsburgh, and as he experienced quite a culture shock when he arrived on campus in Tuscaloosa, Alabama back in 1961. As he writes in his new book, "When I arrived, I was even aware the school was segregated, and if I had known, I probably wouldn't have gone." So now that you think back to those days, and you were right in the middle of it, man, just like you were right in the middle of everything in New York when you became a professional, what are your initial thoughts on the way Alabama was when you arrived?
I didn't know that it wasn't just the University of Alabama, it was the entire Southeastern Conference that was segregated. And segregated was only something that we had heard about in movies, motion pictures. It happened one time back home when a buddy of mine, my closest buddy at the time, from the neighborhood, we went into a store, we had to be 8, maybe 10, 9, whatever. And the lady looked up and she said, "Hey, Namath, you can stay here. You get out of here." And we were stunned. He turned and he split, and I turned and I split. And whenever I went home, I told my mother about it. And my mother didn't mention segregation, but she just said, "Some people, honey, they get angry about, they just don't like other people." She said, "Just don't go back there." And that's all I knew about it.
So that had to be extremely uncomfortable for you when you first arrived at the University of Alabama.
Yeah, there were a few guys, even a few freshmen that used the N-word to call me, and okay. But the majority of the guys, all of them were righteous guys. I figured that. Those that weren't, Coach Bryant ran off.
Right.
I promise you. I didn't know enough about the history of our country, the history of the South. I learned from them that the animal, we reflect our environment when we're brought up. This is the first thing. We infer what our family's doing, what our environment's doing, and we think it's right. These guys weren't, mean. My teammates weren't hateful of other people, and Coach Bryant was a respectful man.
There was a story where after you had left, he had actually asked University of Southern California to come down to Tuscaloosa and play a football game, and they were an integrated football team, and they came down and they beat up Alabama pretty good. And he probably used that, I would think, as some sort of example to show the Alabama Board of Regents that, guys, look, man, we gotta wake up. If we want to be able to move forward as a university and a football program, then we have to integrate. Would you think that that was the case?
I know it was part of it, absolutely.
Yeah.
John McKay, coach of Southern Cal, and Coach Bryant were tight, too. Playing that big game meant a lot to the integration in the South.
You know, you stood there, you saw Governor Wallace talk about segregation, and you saw the opening of the University of Alabama to Vivian Malone. Tell me about her. Tell me about the day that she walked onto the campus of the University of Alabama as you were there.
My girlfriend lived in a dormitory, and I'd go over to the dorm. What ends up, Vivian, when she came, she was in the same dorm. And so I got to meet Vivian, and it was wonderful. I was thrilled that she was there, and I got to know her and really respect her for her bravery, for the way she carried herself.
How was the football team at this time? You know, what was the intensity like?
The National Guard was around the campus, barricading the campus. Coach Bryant, we go back to Coach Bryant.
Right.
He knew it was right. He had already schooled us. He had already talked to the team, man. This was happening. It was supposed to happen. And we all bought in. We, of course, believed it was right, and we just stayed out of the way, man.
It was history, right?
Yeah, it was history. I can remember the federal man standing beside Governor Wallace and say, "Excuse me, Governor Wallace, step aside. This is now a federal issue." And that was that, man.
And that was that, and it was a good thing that it happened. All right, back with Joe Namath for more in a moment.
Game Time with Boomer Esiason is back.
You know, anyone who ever played in the AFL or AFC, especially those of us who followed him as a Jets quarterback, certainly are indebted to Joe Namath for guaranteeing his upstart Jets would defeat the NFL champion Baltimore Colts in Super Bowl III, and then orchestrating a victory in perhaps the most significant game ever because it changed the landscape of the NFL. So you choose the Jets and the AFL over the NFL. Now, what people may not know is that the St. Louis Cardinals of the NFL drafted you as well. Did the St. Louis Cardinals actually agree to trade you to the Giants because you might have wanted to play in New York as opposed to St. Louis?
They asked the gentleman representing me, Mr. Michael Heichelbeit, if it was New York, they could get me over there to the Giants, if that's what I wanted.
You changed the face of the NFL. You guaranteed Super Bowl III, but initially, when you first got to New York, you had signed your contract for $427,000 for 3 years, right? Richest contract in the history of football at that time. They never gave you a physical. They never gave you a physical until they had you for the press conference at Toots Shores. And then Dr. James Nicholas took you into the bathroom and he checked out your knee and said, "We got to give you surgery, son, because your knee is obliterated."
He had me in the hospital the next morning. That's a fact.
So the next day, Dr. Nicholas takes you in and he opens your knee, and what does he find?
Well, torn the cruciate ligaments, anterior and posterior, and torn medial cartilage. Meantime,
How were you walking?
I did injure it 4 more times after that initial time.
Right.
Trying to do. The last time I injured it was taking a luggage out of the back of the car when we were down there for the Orange Bowl game.
How long was the rehab, and what was that like?
The rehab was tough. When I left the hospital, I remember the day leaving the hospital, I had my leg in a cast from my ankle to my thigh. When they wheeled me out, the taxi was waiting there. The nurses, a couple of them, helped me into the taxi cab. I put my leg across the seat. The taxi took me out to LaGuardia Airport, got on the plane and flew to Birmingham. Got off the plane and my buddy Mr. Bite was there with my car. I got in and I drove myself with my right leg across the seat and my left leg handling the gas and the brake to Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
And you knew, did you feel like you were going to be able to play again? I mean, like you just had a sense that you'd be all right?
I had hope. I had confidence in Dr. Nicholas. I had to trust the medical people, but he left a hole open in the side of my cast about 1 inch big. And whenever I flexed my joint, my quadricep, yellow synovial fluid would fly out like a little rainbow coming out of there. He left a hole in my knee.
Writing your new book, so what surprised you about Super Bowl III, but also to know that you also did the audio portion of your new book as well, didn't you?
Thank you for bringing
You're very
that
welcome.
up. You know what? As much as I've really, folks, talked about this book, the publisher asked me about the audio version, what I would think about it, and I said, well, that's great, but I want to do it. I want to do it in my words. I want to say it because I know how I've written this and I know the feelings that are behind it. Yogi Berra, he wrote a book. I want to hear Yogi talking about it.
Exactly.
You know, if you hear the author, I think that's cool.
Well, the beautiful thing about it is you got such a distinctive voice. To hear it from you and you tell the story, then it gives a lot of authenticity and credibility to it. So what did surprise you most about Super Bowl III when you went back and you looked it over and you saw it again?
We didn't play as well as I'd have liked.
Right, but you won.
Don't we always go to the part we didn't get done just
Yes,
right?
exactly.
But watching Matt Snell, watching our offensive line, Snell was a stud that day, and that line just was blocking. And again, our defense held those guys to zero for the longest time.
That,
yeah. So watching it, wishing I had throwing the ball a little differently here, but got away with it.
Well, that's what makes you a perfectionist. You always look for what you did wrong before you look at what you did right. Did you get hurt in that game?
I did, and I had to come off the game. I had a bad right thumb. I mean, I bumped my thumb, and then I hit a helmet, and I had to come off the field right away. It was hurting so bad. Came off the field, and Vito went in, Pirelli, and he was stone cold. He hadn't warmed up. He hadn't thrown a pass, folks.
And he didn't guarantee anything either.
Anyway, he went on the field, and don't you know, the first play he's on the field, they safety blitz. Vito reads it. Bake Turner runs the short post, but Vito's not warmed up, and it's off target. That's the play that came on that tape that I saw for the first time with me throwing it.
So somebody
wait a
edited
minute.
that was not my throw, right?
I couldn't, how did this happen? And you told me that there's something was changed.
I did. I went back and looked at it, and I said that Joe Namath did not throw that pass. I know that. Somebody put Joe Namath in there, and I don't know who did it. Could you imagine if Twitter and social media and all the stuff that is at the fingertips of the players and the fans today were around when you played?
I try to imagine that, and I feel like I wouldn't have liked it. Again, this is hard to believe, but I do like to keep a low profile.
That is hard to believe.
I promise you, folks, and I've said this, it's in the book, and it's somewhat in jest, but 3 older brothers, older sister, until I was 15, I thought my name was Shut Up. You know, you just didn't say things.
If they had today's medical techniques, you ever wonder what your career would have looked like other than Super Bowl III?
Don't waste the time on it. But what I do know is if I didn't have that torn knee, I'd have been in Vietnam, like so many other guys. I went down to Whitehall Street and took a physical, and the guy wanted to take blood out of my right arm. And I gave him my left, you know, as a soldier. He said, "Give me your right arm, son." I said, "Well, it's the same blood. You can take it out of here." You know, it's my throwing arm, Boomer. You
don't be messing with your throwing arm.
And he yells at me again. And I said, "Well, come on." And then an officer walked over, took me out of line, and took me into a private room where I got the rest of my physical. 3 physicals I had to take because the Surgeon General had to issue a report to Congress why Joe Namath was able to play pro football,
But not go to Vietnam.
but not qualify for our military. And the doctors all backed it up as torn ligaments and et cetera.
More with Joe Namath right after this quick TV timeout.
You're watching Game Time with Boomer Esiason.
You know, the degenerative brain disease known as CTE is a serious threat to any football player who suffered concussions during his playing days, of course, and his own personal experience led our guest to become heavily involved in what is now called the Joe Namath Neurological Research Center in Jupiter, Florida. And I know, Joe, that this is near and dear to your heart, and it's something that you and I have talked about many, many years, that you've been fighting to get a better handle on what CTE is all about. So tell us about your center and where you guys are in your research.
Well, we're trying to get the FDA to approve hyperbaric oxygen therapy.
Right.
For people with traumatic brain injuries. And it's not just football players, as we know. I mean, we're talking about kids falling off bicycles, adults driving cars, getting their head. There hasn't been enough study done. And we are doing a study at the Jupiter Medical Center to show the FDA that hyperbaric oxygen therapy, in fact, helps every cell in your body, regenerates the cells. I had 5 concussions that I could count and knew of, and I thought it behooved me to find out what was happening because a former teammate of mine who's still suffering now explained to us about his problems, and it was scary. Watching him deteriorate was scary, and I needed to find out, so I got help. I went and I took a cognitive test first. I could a brain scan, and it showed my brain was not getting the blood flow on the left side from the front to the back. And so I proceeded to take 40 dives.
Yeah.
And the brain started to lighten up a little bit. I did another test, cognitive test, another brain scan, another 40 dives. Hey, look at this brain. It's looking like the other side. It's looking good. I did 120 dives. And then even I followed up a year or 2 after. I started this in 2012. And the last time I had a brain scan was a couple of years ago, and the brain is healthy all over. I know it works, and we've had people go through our study that couldn't move their arm, that's had strokes, couldn't talk. They're back in the workforce doing things. A guy came up to my daughter in a movie theater, turned around, he walked away, and he came back, and he was wiping his eyes. He had been crying. And my daughter looks at him, and he looked at her. He says, "Because of that study you folks are doing over there, my children will get to know their real dad."
Oh, that's great, man.
He had an accident, and he was suffering, and he got treatment.
So quickly, do you think today's players understand the magnitude of what our players are dealing with from our generations?
I hope they understand the magnitude, but you know what? The remuneration, the drive to play, you never think it's going to happen to you. And I just know that hyperbaric oxygen therapy is a plus, that we need it more in our country. 5 countries use it extensively, Israel, Germany, Japan, Canada, you know, and they use it for a good reason.
Well, good luck, Joe, man. All the way, My Life in 4 Quarters, the great Joe Namath book, the great Joe Namath. Thank you so much for joining me. And to all of you out there watching, I'm Boomer Esiason, and I'll see you again right here on Gametime. Our next show features Nadia Comaneci. Good job, man.
This last again. And whenever I flexed my joint, yellow synovial fluid would fly out like a little rainbow coming out of it.